Okay, well, thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to your presentations at the end of the semester, but tonight you get to hear mine. And this is a continuation of what I talked about last year on exactly the same date, March 1st last year. Mostly dealing with the scriptures that inform us about engineering and ethics. It's interesting that among all of the topics that the Bible speaks to, engineering is mentioned, if only in terms of the engines that the ancients used to defend cities and attack them. And then there's cunning men who designed those machines. So I expect you all have been able to watch this as kind of a foundation for what I have to say tonight. So this was the conclusion from last year, that ethical difficulties are going to happen. They're inevitable, but by seeking first the kingdom of God, you will work through these things. And there are a lot of scriptures that deal with just how to live with respect to other people around you. So just being a human being and being a Christian in your behavior tells you most of what you need to know when it comes to engineering ethics. But at the end of the presentation last year, I took questions from the three engineers from the class of 21, and they really wanted to know some details. They wanted to know the practical side of things. And your questions that you've given to me tonight are along those same lines. It's great to know scripture. It's great to know that it's relevant to your situation. But how does this work in practice? And so I want to deal with that issue primarily tonight. I could answer the question kind of flippantly. It comes to that word know. How do you know that you know anything? What is knowledge based upon? And when you start to look into knowledge itself and the ways in which we know things, that will help inform us on how do we know the will of the Lord for us in different situations. So my topic tonight is more toward the practical side of things, and really Scripture talks about knowing things by faith, and putting that faith into practice is what we'll mostly be talking about tonight. So that whole issue of knowledge falls under the category of epistemology in physics. Now, I believe you've all taken faith, science, and reason by now, and if it's the same way in which it was given to me, that course is designed to expose students to the field of epistemology, and then for them to build upon that understanding to cultivate their particular worldview, that everybody will see the world differently, and they'll place values in different categories of life differently. But an epistemology and a Christian worldview is those are kind of the outcomes of that course. And so rationalism, empiricism, and subjectivism are described in the course as the ways in which most people come to judgments about what they know. And usually they combine them in some way. All three of those ways of knowing things are described in Scripture, so there isn't one biblical way of knowing things. They all have legitimacy in the way the Lord deals with the great variety of people that are out there. So when it comes to thinking about ethics in the context of a worldview, sometimes ethics is not a highly valued thing in Christian circles, because ethics has the connotation of something that is socially determined or socially constructed. It is the code of ethics that professionals adopt in one way or the other. And there is indeed an engineer's code of ethics that I talked about last year. So those are ethical principles that are agreed upon by engineers for engineers, and other professions have the same sort of thing. But Christians tend to prefer to look at things in biblical terms. Certainly there is merit in that. We want to found our beliefs and our ways of living on the scriptures. And yet there are social processes there too. The way in which we understand scripture comes to us from the work of Christians through the centuries and the ways in which people have agreed to interpret scripture. And of course, there are many differences in how that happens, different views of baptism or the Lord's Supper, and on and on and on. So social processes matter, but we don't really know how they matter. We don't really know the extent to which those social processes will produce good results. But it seems clear to me that God works through all of those things. Certainly, I don't have a corner on knowledge, and my interpretation of scripture and science and everything else is full of flaws because I'm a fallen creature. And we work with other Christians and other people to come to an understanding of things. So epistemology is really what we're about tonight, of how do we understand ethics and how do we know what the right thing to do is in this context of a fallen world with social processes mattering in different ways. Now, for me, I came to be an engineer. I came to be who I am today by lots of social processes, both educational and workplace and otherwise. You recently in chapel heard about callings and how you might pray and seek a calling in your career. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But the message in that chapel service was that you don't really get a roadmap. You don't get a step-by-step answer to those questions sometimes. But as you work your way through situations, God can reveal these things to you. And certainly that's been the case for me. I got interested in engineering in the 60s when the space shots were going off, Mercury and Gemini and Apollo. And I pursued an engineering education once I learned what an engineer was through different schools. I went to George Washington University thinking I would be a civil engineer. They got my job with the Navy, with the Navy R&D lab. And I was really interested in the work they were doing, but they wanted mechanical engineers. So I switched from civil to mechanical. And I've been one ever since, I guess. In 1997, 20 years after I started working for one of my mentors at the Navy lab, my job would have gone to Philadelphia, and I decided I didn't want to go there. So I changed jobs, worked for Defense Logistics Agency, became an R&D program manager in distribution, which I knew nothing about. But because I knew engineering practice, I knew R&D processes, I knew one particular process that DLA had never participated in. And on the basis of that little information, I became a manager of a fairly significant project for the agency. That ran from 2005 through 2008. And then I started looking ahead to whether or not I wanted to retire. 2012 was when I turned 55, and under the old system, that's when I could retire. Teaching as a second career was one of the options I looked into, and I took courses at Virginia Tech's Northern Virginia Center. I kind of backed my way into it. I really liked the subject, and I ended up going down to Blacksburg to study there full time and finish my classes. So in 2014, I went to Mount Vernon Nazarene University, started their engineering program there, essentially doing the work that Dr. Wintorf has been doing here. I never expected to teach engineering, but the opportunity arose, and it was a good experience to be there those 4 years and get things going. That program is now accredited, and I think it has 70 or 80 students. It's fairly large because they have two concentrations there, electrical and mechanical engineering. So when I look back at my almost 65 years in my working life, I'm convinced that God had a lot to do with all of those things. In many of the times when I changed direction, say when I moved from the Navy to DLA, when I transferred from one college to another, a lot of those decisions were made in retrospect for very shaky reasons or very limited knowledge. And yet in each situation, it seems that God opened doors for me and I learned lessons and I was successful in different ways. Now, kind of depends on what your definition of success is. There were situations where from the outside, I certainly would not be considered to be successful, or I was not successful in the eyes of some of the people around me. And yet, in many cases, those experiences really helped me understand my life and my walk with the Lord and how he works in these situations. So I think this is kind of a blanket statement that I believe in, although success in different situations certainly looked different. What is success? I really like the phrase that shows up in this Westminster Larger Catechism. If you've never read the Westminster Confession of Faith or the shorter or longer catechism, this may be quite unfamiliar to you. But this idea of quiet of conscience, notwithstanding daily failings, is a piece of this. I have this on my door of my office because I do the best I can in every situation, but I fail too. So my best is certainly not all it should be or could be. And yet it is, I experience that in the context of God's will for my life. And so question 55 really has to do with the work that Christ is doing now, that after his ascension and after his going to sit at the right hand of the Father, Scripture tells us that Jesus intervenes for us. He prays for us. I suppose Catholics would understand this in terms of the saints praying for us, but not being a Catholic, I hold to the supremacy of Jesus' intercession for us. And it is in that context that my life unfolds. And though people could accuse me of doing the wrong thing at time or doing a poor job of whatever it is, somehow or the other, the way in which I experience life, the way in which I live life, is part of the will that the Father has for me through life. So that's a kind of personal definition of success that I hold to. That if I can go to, and sleep at night, if I can do my job in whatever struggles I might be having, and feel like I'm doing my best, then I will, in that sense, be successful. And that's really all that matters in the end. So that's a kind of a personal perspective on things. And I think other scriptures support that. That we're all sinners, and yet the scriptures inform us about our salvation through Christ. And scriptures give us many promises about our lives and promises for the life to come. And I think this proverb speaks to this uncertainty we have in life, that we can make plans, we can fold into it all of the things that we might consider to be important in every situation and make the best possible choices, sometimes making mistakes. And over and above that, God has sovereignty over the ways in which you live your life. God makes things happen much more than we do. Again, that might be a little on the theoretical level. So what are the details of this? I think it happens in many, many different ways. Clearly, your aptitudes have something to do with it. I don't know if you've taken aptitude tests, but you test and demonstrate your aptitude every day when you go to class and every time you do an assignment and all those sorts of things. Aptitude is alone is not sufficient. I worked with a fellow at MVNU whose thought was that if you are good at math, then maybe God has called you to engineering. And I think that certainly math aptitude is a good thing, but math can be useful in lots of places. So that alone is not sufficient. We have to look to those around us and to our circumstances for confirmation that that's what we need to do. And I think desires come into this too. Sometimes we want to do things for logical, rational reasons, and sometimes just because we want to, or because we don't want to. I think God uses those desires sometimes in mysterious ways to guide us into what we should be doing and need to do. And there are other ways that God speaks to our hearts in all kinds of ways. And I think all of those things matter when it comes to ethical situations too, and the decisions we have to make with regard to ethical matters, whether we change jobs or not, whether we go along with the path that a company or an organization is on, whether we sometimes go along to get along. That's the phrase that sometimes is used. Certainly getting along is valuable to us, but that shouldn't be everything either. Now, again, you heard Brian Dick speak at chapel, I believe. I hope all of you were there. I thought it was an excellent message that he gave. It is, of course, on the YouTube along with all the other chapel messages. So I would go and listen to that if you have not heard that. Brian Dick is a social psychologist. He's a Christian. His interests have been in defining what callings are and how they affect people's successes in workplace and how they feel about their workplace experiences. And it's very interesting how if someone feels that they have a calling, their attitude toward work can be very different from someone who only goes to work to earn a salary. And so after speaking to chapel, he came over to do a seminar for the faculty. And so these are some of the slides from that meeting. It wasn't enough. One point he made was it's not enough to understand that you have a calling, but you really have to live it too. So you have to be in a place where your calling goes along with what you do and is supportive of that. And there was some advice in the meeting of how to help students prepare for their work, how to identify their callings, and how to live them out. And so these are some of the things that were part of that meeting. There were instructions to faculty to have students test their assumptions. This kind of goes along with the idea of having some critical thinking skills. You don't just assume that things are the way they appear to be, but you kind of test those ideas to see whether they are legitimate or not. Being proactive about things, of being decisive about things, of setting a direction and going in that direction is part of that. faculty should share stories of failure and resilience. And I've certainly had failures in my life, and sometimes they are more informative than the successes are. I'll share some of those with you later on. Recognizing that change is a given. It's sometimes said that change is inevitable, but progress is optional. Well, we want to make the progress of the result of change not simply something that happens by accident. By the way, I'll be making all these slides available to you, so there's no need to write things down here. And again, one of the interesting things about my career was the fact that I had the same boss for 20 years. So in that respect, I didn't experience as many changes perhaps as other people do, but I certainly saw a lot of different bosses when I worked for DLA. It seemed like the rate at which my supervisors changed accelerated the closer I got to retirement. And some of the worst bosses I ever had were toward the end of my government career. And then just discussing how faith shapes your work, how God has given you work for a purpose, that work was instituted in Genesis before the fall. So having work and doing work is part of what we experience and feel our humanity. So work is a good thing, and understanding that in the context of our faith is a big deal in that. So these are some of the messages that Dr. Dick gave faculty in that follow-on meeting. He ends up with three kind of essential questions that relate to work. Now, some of your questions had to do with understanding the ethics or the good or bad qualities of some of the things that you're working on. I think some of these questions speak to that. What aspects of work in one job or another are rooted in the way things were created before the fall? Adam and Eve were given the task of tilling the garden, of taking care of that, cultivating a culture among human beings. And some engineering work is more toward that end of things than other things. How is creation preserved, developed, cultivated as part of that? Now, of course, I worked for the Navy and then a broader agency in the Defense Department. And sometimes people will say the Defense Department's work is to kill people and break things. And there's certainly that aspect of it. There are Christians who would be very uncomfortable working for a military organization. I did not. I'm not a pacifist. So the idea that we were protecting a free country, the United States, against the Soviet Union was a big part of my thinking through the 80s and into the 90s. But it was not without stress. I remember particularly, I don't know if I've told you this story or not, but I remember particularly that sometime right before Christmas one year, I was involved in doing some simulation modeling of the hydraulic system on an Ohio-class submarine. And so besides steering and maintaining depth and all of that, well, what are some of the hydraulic loads? Well, the loads we were looking at were the loads to open and close missile doors and go through the launch process. So here I am looking forward to Christmas, to the birth of the Prince of Peace, and I'm simulating the end of the world, the launch of all these nuclear weapons. So it's kind of a jarring thing to realize, but at the same time, I don't have any regrets about the work I did for the Navy. And we were, in fact, at peace through most of that time, especially in terms of peace with the Soviet Union. Of course, today's news with Ukraine and all that gives us reason to understand that military affairs are seem to be part of our existence, unfortunately or not. But what about the preservation of life and cultivating things? Well, I had the good fortune when I worked for Defense Logistics Agency to work on projects having to do with expeditionary logistics. And so we've assembled a team of people, equipment, processes, so that DLA folks could go forward in a deployment and move things around and keep track of supplies. And in some cases, that work has been done for military reasons, but it's also been done for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief reasons. So the work that I did, we call it the DDXX, it was deployed to West Africa during the Ebola crisis that they had a few years ago. So they were managing medical supplies and equipment that was sent in to keep people alive there. It's gone to the U.S. Gulf Coast several times in the wake of hurricanes. And one year in particular, it was deployed to Alabama because they had hurricane relief efforts going on in both Florida and Texas. So they were able to send supplies to Alabama. They could sort it out, keep track of it, and dispatch it east or west to help people in those situations. So there is some overlap between the capabilities that military units have and those capabilities that are needed in humanitarian situations. It's easy to answer this second one. In what ways has this area of work been impacted by the fall? Well, if we didn't have the fall, I don't think we would need a military. We wouldn't need weapons. We wouldn't need locks on the doors. There's lots of things that we would not need. But looking around at gadgets, looking around at cars or houses or computers or what have you, and thinking about the issues that arise because of the fall and how you might mitigate those is certainly an area where Christian influences can take hold. The whole issue, say, of computer security is an area where the fall affects things. But if you can make systems that address those security concerns in a benign or a redeemed kind of way, hey, that's pretty good. So by using fingerprints or bodily features, eyes or whatnot, I think those are developments that make our lives flow a little more easily in spite of the fact that we have these security concerns that go with things. And then what would it look like if an area was, quote unquote, fully redeemed? Now, Dr. Dick, in his presentation at the chapel, talked about businesses that have arisen in that way. And so sometimes a Christian might have a vision of some problem and some way to solve that problem that would be uniquely driven by our relationship with the Lord. I have not been in the position to do that, but I know that others have been in that position. And it's pretty cool when things work out that way. Now, you three gave me a number of questions, and Isaac gave me some questions too. I looked them over, and I've kind of written paraphrases to them and combined them in different ways. And so these are the four questions that I'd like to address in the remaining minutes we have. First of all, the question of should we be engaged in assessing ethics, and how would that unfold? So should Christian engineers assess the ethics in their work and the products? Pretty easy to say, well, sure, we should do that. You don't want to be working in an area where there are all kinds of problems that come out of your work. It's rather obvious, isn't it? The problem is that you can be engaged in all kinds of things. And for one reason or another, you can come to the conclusion that it's the right thing to do. Certainly your employer is going to be telling you it's the right thing to do. Maybe your customers are going to be telling you that. You would have self-interest in continuing your employment. You would earn a salary, you have time off, and all those kind of things. So it's really, really easy to talk yourself into a positive judgment of what work you're doing, without considering all that goes into it. And my little parenthetical there, I mean, I'm sure the people that have evil intent from our point of view sometimes think they are doing the right thing too. So designing a suicide vest or an IED or something like that. I'm sure that the people that engage in those sorts of activities, they think they're doing the right thing too. So how do you sort all this out? It's not easy. And sometimes the ways in which work unfolds kind of act to blind us to things too. Are you familiar with this designer, sponsor, user triangle way of looking at things? Yeah, that's a common way of thinking about the design process and of thinking about the stakeholders that arise in one gadget or another. So a designer, an engineer has a job to do. They work for an organization, a boss, and somebody ends up using whatever they're developing. Now, who has the voice of the customer in this situation? Sometimes the customer is easily identified and can sit down with you in a conference room and talk about things. Sometimes not. Sometimes the sponsor or sometimes the people you're selling a product to will, quote unquote, speak for the customer. Sometimes you as a designer will be a user of that product. So if you're in an automotive field, well, we all drive cars, don't we? So we know something about that directly from our experience, but in other cases, not. And many, many engineered systems, many, many technical systems have ended up missing the mark because the voice of that user is sometimes not represented, or the voice of other stakeholders is not represented well. And you many times will get into this situation of asking you, who makes the final decision? Does the designer get to make the final decision, or does the sponsor? Or is there some kind of representative from the user that gets to make the decisions? Things get lost in this complication of multiple stakeholders being in things. And sometimes you will realize, well, we've gone down this road and we've developed this gadget and it's missed the mark. And sometimes the reasons will be obvious and sometimes not. Sometimes those reasons for failure won't appear for many years. I'm sure that Henry Ford and the other people who developed automobiles through the 20th century would be shocked by the idea that there are folks that view the internal combustion engine as one of the most terrible inventions of mankind. Al Gore wrote his book about climate change and all, scolding people for viewing internal combustion engines favorably. So sometimes you just can't know. Sometimes you will be engaged in work and you will have the best of intentions and all of the signs will point toward a good outcome. And yet years later, sometimes the outcome can be quite different. You just can't know. You just can't know. It really ends up being a matter of faith. how God is going to use your work, in many cases, can be completely outside of your control. In my experience working for the military, sometimes you get into special complications there because secrecy is required. Secrecy is required in competitive businesses sometimes too. And so you don't openly talk about what you're doing and get all of the information during the design process. So that's a source of concern that people should have. You may be familiar with Steve Jobs and his very special career, that he understood way before most people did what personal computers could be and what they would do for them. And so he basically came to the position that users can't really be expected to tell you what they want. You as the designer have to figure it out. So there's a different, completely different side to this. Sometimes we will think that the user should drive things, but in many cases they aren't really able to do that because of what they know or don't know about whatever the technology is. So that ends up being a somewhat complicated question to answer in practice. To what extent can Christians affect these things? Just because you're a Christian doesn't mean anybody's going to listen to you, of course. My experience is that people are a lot more welcoming to inputs from Christians than you would think. There is this common popular understanding nowadays that issues of right and wrong are socially constructed. So not only do we, as a society, build organizations and enterprises and make products based upon kind of group consensus, we sort out right and wrong matters that way too. And so there, in some cases, there's actually an eagerness for different voices to be heard in describing ethical issues, of framing those issues in ways that can lead to improved outcomes. Now, I've added the words in the middle bullet there, strong opinions graciously expressed. It takes some tact to do this, tact that I'm not always prepared to exercise. But sharing with people your views of what's right and wrong, and of speaking up, perhaps for underrepresented or non-represented stakeholders in the project, many times that can be very much welcomed. Now, you do have organizations that will kind of convene user groups or meetings to discuss the ethics of this, that, and the other. And sometimes they kind of stack the deck to get the result they want. That is always a possibility. Sometimes business cases are that way. We want to do this, go come up with a business case to justify what we want to do. But in many other cases, having a diversity of voices on these issues is actually welcomed. I remember in particular a guy I worked with at Defense Logistics Agency. He was responsible for managing money at the organization I was at. And as an engineer, I needed money to do something. And I remember having conversations with him. And very early in the discussions, I started to suspect that he was a Christian, because he would talk about a lot of these things in terms of what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do, and how do we judge what is right and wrong in how we make financial decisions. And these last two questions here, who pays for this and who benefits from this? Should not there be some kind of connection between the people that benefit and the people that pay? And so he would talk his way through these financial decisions in a very moral, kind of ethical reasoning. Very, very refreshing to work with this guy. And he was very highly regarded by the organizations because of his ability to frame financial decisions in terms of what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. What are some kinds of ethical issues that arise in engineering? Well, they come in all different shapes and sizes. What can I say about that? That last word in the first sentence is critical. I think engineers and other technical people want to deal with things in kind of a rational, logical, scientific way. A culture sometimes is very difficult to characterize in those terms. Culture has to do with the values that an organization holds dear. Sometimes those values will be expressed in a vision statement or a mission statement or other things that you can hang on the wall. And those workplace cultures can be hugely different, even in the same line of work sometimes, considering all kinds of different things there. The purpose of what you're doing, the way in which the organization is structured and governed, whether it is an organization that's owned by some other large organization or not, whether it's a small business or sole proprietorship, that kind of thing. The ways in which different stakeholders exercise power and over things. I will say that here at Grace, it seems to me that the board that supervises the work of the president in the college is much more active than the board at Mount Vernon Nazarene University, where it came from. And I think that's a good thing. I think there's having a diversity of people on the board who exercise not only oversight, but influence operations. I think that's a good thing. Whether an organization is well or sick or dying, bankrupt, or all kinds of things. The pace at which work is done. Working for the Navy in a Navy R&D lab, many times it seemed that there was not much of a sense of urgency. It takes a long time to conceive of a new class of ships and do all the design work and cut steel and weld it all together. It takes maybe a decade to do that. And so the idea of a sense of urgency at that workplace, it really just didn't exist much. But it did when I worked for DLA. When they were engaged in supporting military operations around the world, they had the sense that they wanted to get things done now. There's competition between organizations, sometimes inside the organization. Boy, attitudes towards risk, that was certainly true between DLA and the Navy. The Navy lab I worked at had a very high acceptance of risk. They wanted high payoff, risky, difficult projects. And if you failed 3 times out of 4, they were good with that. Sometimes that had a negative consequence, that you could be working on something that you realized was a waste of time, and yet there would be pressure to continue doing that. I experienced that from the end of my co-op time until a project died about 10 years later. So about 5 years into this project, we started having doubts about whether it was a good thing to do. And yet it persisted another 5 years with spending money and spending labor and all that. DLA, quite the opposite. So you really need to have some grasp of the cultural influences on your job. Yes, you can remain technical. Maybe that's where you want to spend your career. Maybe you don't want to move into management. You want to be the technical expert until you retire. But having some feel for what the culture is and how it affects your work and how you might influence it, that's an important piece of this. There are people who just poo-poo everything as, oh, well, that's politics. I don't get involved in politics. And politics can be very distasteful. but understanding it is part of your job. And if you poo-poo the influences on your work, many times that will be interpreted as a kind of a negativity that managers will not want there to be around. You don't want to go the other extreme and become a politician, because that can have negative consequences too. So somewhere in the middle, having an understanding of it and finding ways to affect the culture positively is a good goal to have. Now, where does this all end? I think there was a good question about red flags that can arise. There are times when you should really be concerned about whether you belong in a place or not. And what are some of those red flags? Certainly when health starts to be affected, that's a red flag. I remember times when my work was very stressful, where I would have difficulty sleeping, where it started to affect my digestion. If those sorts of things happen, your health is starting to be affected, well, you really have to ask some serious questions. Do you want to remain there? Are there things you need to do to cope with those stresses in better ways? I think that's certainly a red flag that pops up. Otherwise, sometimes you will have a sense of the way things are, and there will be such disconnects between your way of seeing things and the way other people see things that you start to have to question, is this person living in the same world that I am? And you can all, of course, ask yourself that same question: am I missing the boat here? But when the disconnects between you and your coworkers or you and your manager get to be really big, you have to start asking those questions. I was asked, one of the questions had to do with viewing a coworker or a manager as your enemy. We really don't like to think of our coworkers as our enemies. So when you reach the point where you can't help but ask the question, is this person working with me or against me? That's a red flag. And I can view this in several ways, technically, legally, and culturally. I want to give you a copy of an article I wrote. To tell you the truth, I don't know if I've given this to you already or not, but the most difficult ethical situation I dealt with in my career came when I was working for DLA. I was the chief of the value engineering branch. Value engineering as a way of saving the government money. That's the most thankless job ever. But my supervisor changed, and the new supervisor pretty much wanted to ignore the legal basis for what we were doing. Congress had passed a law that basically said government agencies with a certain amount of dollars at stake were required to practice value engineering methods. The Defense Department has kind of an internal police force, which they refer to as an inspector general. So the IG had come around to VLA one time and basically had said, you are not following the law because your value engineering office isn't doing what it's supposed to do. And between me and my original boss, we were working on ways to solve that problem. And then the new boss came in and could care less about all of it. They basically just wanted to dump any engineering issue on the value engineering office. Its mission be damned. And this seemed to be, to me, a gross disconnect between the legal purpose of the office and what we were being told and asked to do. And I very seriously started looking at other places to work at that time. I experienced it previously on the technical side of things. This project I mentioned a minute ago that lasted 10 years, 5 years after we started to have doubts about its validity, was that kind of thing as well. That our management had invested money in this project, they wanted it to succeed, but the technical means to do it was limited. And at the same time, the problem that the Navy was having that led to the project being started had changed. So there really wasn't a desire from, say, the fleet for the solution we were working with. Now, it didn't get ugly there, but it certainly was a situation where there was a red flag in the air. I've been working on this thing for 10 years now. Should I work on it for an 11th year? And fortunately, we were able to persuade folks to just give it up and have us move on to other subjects. This video on the expert that we'll watch here in a minute is kind of a description of kind of a ridiculous description, but it's kind of a description of the ways in which different people can view a project and view it in ways that just disconnect from reality. And that happens in more cases than you would think. There are many projects, many products that have been developed because the people involved thought it would be a good idea, but everybody around them is looking at it like, what were they thinking? It happens. Smart people make sometimes really smart / dumb mistakes. So that video on the expert is worth watching. When it comes to culture and our life in this world, there are a number of books that I think of very highly that have been very informative for me. Jacques Ellul is an interesting guy. Of those books, it's the only one that really doesn't speak to engineering specifically. But Ellul was a French Christian. He was trained as a sociologist. He started out life as a Marxist before he became a Christian. And he retained some of his ability to criticize capitalist and Western society from his days as a Marxist. But in most of his work, he essentially leaves his Christian credentials off to the side. He doesn't really bring things into discussion from a Christian point of view. But in this book, he does. This is kind of the exception to that. And so Ellul's criticisms of the technological society and the reliance we place on gadgets is very insightful. And in this book, he develops this as a theological problem that the West deals with. He understands, he makes the statement that Western society has made an idol of efficiency. So when you make efficiency an idol, you leave out of the picture a lot of things that are important. He's not rejecting of technology. He just says that technology has kind of gotten loose and run amok. And so this idea of redeeming technology to match the created order that God would want is kind of part of this. He makes a very bold statement in there that essentially that the world apart from Christ is bent on suicide. And we are committing suicide by more and more relying upon mechanical or automatic devices rather than on human ingenuity and human creativity and human culture. So that's a book that I would recommend. It's not very thick. The second book is not very thick either. And I think I thought that I brought it, but this is it has a thought-provoking title, The Ghost of the Executed Engineer. Who wants to be executed as an engineer? And so this is a look at how engineering developed during the rise of the Soviet Union. And the wacky ways in which the totalitarian state views engineers. Engineers are smart people. And you all understand not only the technical aspects of things, but you can see that organizations and commerce and other things sometimes do weird things with technical things. And so the Soviet Union developed a suspicion of engineers, that these engineers not only want to make the gadgets we want, but they want to fix Soviet society, and we can't let that happen. And so this is a very interesting book about a very unhealthy culture in which engineering should operate. Very much a disconnection from reality. The way people are made, the way they want to live their lives, was kind of ignored by the Soviet Union authorities. A couple other books over here closer to engineering. Larry Miles is considered to be the founder of value engineering, and he developed this as a way of analyzing the value of different things. Very interesting story. He's written a biography as well that's quite interesting. And I believe that he was a Christian, although I don't know it. He was an engineer for GE during World War II. And during the war, there were shortages of materials. And sometimes manufacturing companies could not make military hardware according to the print. What are you going to do? Miles had the thought that we should not necessarily make things to the print. We should make things in accordance with the function that the gadget serves. So defining function is a big piece of value analysis for this. And then once you identify in very elementary levels what the function is, you can start to come up with alternatives that will meet that function. But lots and lots of people thought, well, that's fine. We can satisfy the military requirements, but clearly, since it's not according to the original drawing, it will be just a stopgap. Well, lo and behold, they found out that in most cases, the alternative designs were better than the original ones. That if you started to think of things in terms of their functions and the hierarchy of functions that made a system work, you could make improvements. And so after the war, GE had the thought, well, why can't we do this all the time? And they kind of turned loose Miles to do this. And unfortunately, a lot of the work that he did was not picked up by American industry, but it was picked up by the Japanese, who were much more interested in innovative ways of doing things. So value engineering is currently a worldwide proposition. It is active in the United States, but only in a limited set of circumstances. Just a fascinating subject. At some point, I'd love to teach an elective here at Grace on value engineering. And then the last one over there, I don't know if you've ever heard of this book or not, The Goal. I'm sure that Larry Miles' book has not been a big seller. It's a good book, but has a very limited audience. The Goal is a bestseller. It says down the bottom, over 2 million copies sold. I don't know when that was printed. But he tells a story. This is a book about management of a technical organization, written as a story. And it reaches some very, very interesting conclusions. They're all wrapped up in what's described as the theory of constraints. So this is another kind of breakthrough look at the way businesses operate It will really be an eye opener for you if you find the time to read this after graduation. Don't drop what you're doing to read these things. So these are my recommendations for you. Where do we go from here? Hey, reaching the conclusion here. It will take wisdom to work your way through these things. And fortunately, Scripture promises that God's wisdom is available to us. If you have confidence in yourself, confidence in your relationship with God, there shouldn't be any shame in admitting you don't know what's going on. It won't necessarily be easy. It won't necessarily be quick to work through some of these struggles. But God is working in the world. He will be working in your lives, and going to God for wisdom in accordance with James 1. The book of James has lots of wisdom. It's kind of like the Proverbs book of the New Testament. So this verse out of the first chapter, I think, is very much relevant. So go with confidence, go with the belief in God, and know that things will work out, even in hard times, even when there are failures and problems. God can be working through those things for your good and for the good of others. And that's pretty much all I have to say. So I'm going to stop recording this message.